morning is all about unpacking an old saying. Pride comes before the fall. It's about pride versus humility. And as I was sort of thinking about this, about three things came to mind. The first thing that came to mind was today is the first day I've been able to get my trousers on by myself, right? So that's, that's a very humbling experience. And I'd just like to thank my teammates who contributed to my condition. So that's great. The other thing that came to mind was a joke I heard from a comedian many years ago who said, I was given a trophy for humility once, but they took it off me because I showed everyone, I thought it always comes to mind. The other thing that came to mind is the classic clips that you see of people who are doing athletics and they're on the home stretch, and they assume they're going to win, and it's like, only to be, they go, look at me, look how amazing I am, only to be pipped at the last moment by another competitor. Pride versus humility. And so this morning I want to begin by introducing an idea. And the idea is this. As Christ followers, our biggest enemy is pride. But our best friend is humility. And when I say pride, I mean doing things in our own strength, or taking credit for something else someone has done, or putting ourselves on a pedestal before others, right? And Daniel chapter 4, friends, is a lesson in pride. And it was because of Nebuchadnezzar's pride that God cuts him down. Now, for those of you that have been, following the last few weeks, you will know that King Nebuchadnezzar has had some interesting experiences up till this point. He has his first dream of an image in chapter 2 that sets him up for an ego trip in chapter 3, which leads to the instance of the fiery furnace. And on both of those occasions, through the actions of Daniel and or his friends, Nebuchadnezzar ends up endorsing the one true God. It's an interesting thing that happens in chapters 2 and 3 of Daniel. But up until chapter 4, he endorses, but he doesn't believe. Right? And as I was thinking about this, I was going, oh my goodness, it's another challenge for us. And the challenge for us out of that alone is this idea that even though Nebuchadnezzar praised Daniel's God, he didn't believe in him and he didn't submit to him. You see, his language was right in the moment, but his lifestyle was wrong. And I think it's the same warning for us today. I think that some people can attend church, and when I say this, I don't have anyone specifically in mind, all right? Just putting it out there. But I think some people can attend church and use the right language, but they don't really honour God with their lives. So does our profession of faith line up with our lifestyle? Now, the good news for Nebuchadnezzar is that I believe in chapter 4 that he actually becomes a true believer. And in chapter 4, we see the process he goes through to get there. God once again speaks to Nebuchadnezzar through a dream. And the amazing thing about this chapter, friends, is that it was written by King Nebuchadnezzar himself. I think chapter 4 gives us an insight into Nebuchadnezzar personally. He's going to talk about another dream that once again terrifies him, that is about him, of which then comes to pass. All that in itself is amazing. So let's turn to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4, and I'm reading from the New International Version. Some of your texts will have a title that says Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a tree or something similar to that. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth. Notice that this is a public declaration. It's to all the nations of the Babylonian Empire. This declaration is from the then world leader to everyone. We can visualize his messengers, if you like, going through the kingdom and pinning these declarations on walls and trees, on the equivalent of public notice boards everywhere. To the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I love the King James Version. May peace be multiplied unto you. That's what it says. Verse 2, it is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. Now guys, this is the pagan world leader, right? Acknowledging that he has discovered the real living God. And when we get to the end of this, you'll understand why I think, personally, I'm not the only one, other commentators do, but I believe that Nebuchadnezzar will be in heaven. And, by the way, I think it might surprise him as much as it surprises a lot of people. I think people will walk into heaven and go, what are you doing here? But anyway, it continues, verse 3. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. Again, an amazing statement. This is the pagan king to a pagan world, right? His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. That's an amazing statement because it's a complete reversal of what he dreamt about in chapter 2. If you cast your mind back, he has this dream which is about successive empires. And then in chapter 3, he does this thing where he forgets about the successive empires, he sets himself up. But here Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that God's kingdom is not like that at all. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. Now, friends, this declaration that Nebuchadnezzar makes today, he arrives at through a lot of pain and suffering. And now, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. He's going to describe what happened to him that helped him arrive at this conclusion. For some of us in this room, when we came to a point in our lives to declare that God is God, right? His kingdom is eternal. For some of us, to get to that point, it was a very painful journey. And you might look at this, and even though it might not be as extreme as we're going to read, there might be things that you would look back on and go, oh my goodness, that was me. But thank you, Lord, that your kingdom has come in my life. But anyway, verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. So this is the second dream, all right? It's not the same dream as chapter 2. I had a dream that made me afraid. So notice that this dream didn't just trouble him, it scared him. He was afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. And I find this surprising, because you sort of think, so here we go, he summons all the wise men, and didn't we go through that in chapter 2? However, the thing to remember is that this might have been as much as 20 years later, okay? Verse 7, when the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Now, I think back, to chapter 2, that Nebuchadnezzar was clearly concerned then because he thought that these guys were going to pull the wool over his eyes. But it seems here that something unusual's happened where they have said, we can't interpret it for you. See the shift? Verse 8. I love this. It's like the man turns up. Finally, Daniel came into my presence. And I love that verse, and I find it interesting because the text uses his Jewish name. Again, pagan king, pagan empire, declaration to the world. This guy had been renamed. And in fact, if you look at the text, they then go to put on the name in brackets, right? Daniel was a very prominent man, probably in a prime minister type role, who was probably known throughout the empire as Belteshazzar. But anyway, verse 8. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. And I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians. A skip of the language, slur, that didn't quite work there. But anyway, chief of the magicians. So we see all of this time later that he is still in charge of the astrologers and the advisors. And I think maybe this is why they might have been honest before the king on this occasion. By the way, I find it amazing that this guy, he rises to this position. Remember, he probably arrived there when he was about 18, so he's in some kind of prime minister role for the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Then when Nebuchadnezzar passes away, his grandson, there's a whole quick successions that happen, but when his grandson comes to power, he then puts Daniel in a similar role. Daniel doesn't want to be in that role, we'll see. And when the empire is conquered, Daniel's left in charge. Then when Cyrus turns up, the next leader, he goes, Prime Minister. So suddenly he's the Prime Minister of the next empire as well. And under the Persians, he's given a title called Chief of the Magi, which is interesting because I think that's the origins of where the Christmas story and the Magi who have been waiting for a star, I think that comes back to chapter 6 in the book of Daniel. But anyway, jumping ahead. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar continues. He's speaking to Daniel. I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying on my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. And the King James Version says, in the middle of the world. And its height was enormous. So remember, in his first dream, an image or a statue took centre stage. But in this dream, it's a huge tree. Verse 11, the tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. So that's quite a tree. There is a whole theory of giant trees from the ancient world, by the way. No, rabbit hole. I'm not going down that track. Sorry. Verse 12. Its leaves are beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. Verse 13, in the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger. The King James Version says a watcher, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. So we've got the build-up. A huge, fabulous tree that brings shelter and safety to the known world is cut down. Its fruit is scattered, and the animals and the birds flee. And so the king, something in him is going, there's something very disturbing about this. But the angel's instructions continue. Verse 15. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals amongst the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times, that's 7 years, pass by for him. So did you notice how this is going? There's sort of like this image of this tree. It's like the idiom is changing from a tree to something that's actually quite personal. Look at the language. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals. Let his mind be changed. So the tree, whatever that is, isn't going to die. It's going to be cut down, but its roots are still there. And as we look at this, we begin to see that this tree represents a person. Verse 16, let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. Now, I just want to flag it, people, that this use of the term 7 times is quite interesting and quite helpful. The reason I say this is that when we get into the prophecy section of Daniel, the term 7 times is used quite regularly. And there's been lots of debate as to what does 7 times mean. But the beautiful thing is we have this thing that happens in chapter 4 where we know that 7 times literally meant 7 years. And so it's almost like in this dream there's this key to understanding prophecy that is dropped in. So we know that Nebuchadnezzar undergoes an affliction for 7 years, literally. The text continues, verse 17. The decision is announced by messengers, the holy ones. They declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. So this tree, this person, is going to be chopped down. Why? Because it's a lesson about the sovereignty of God. You see, friends, I think like Nebuchadnezzar, you and I like to think that we're in charge. Right? It's human nature. We like to think that we're in charge. But who's really in charge? God is in charge. Verse 18. Here we go. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, note, this isn't because Daniel has some kind of super skill. Nebuchadnezzar has learnt from experience that the Holy Spirit is in Daniel, but at this stage on the historical timeline, they don't have the language for it yet. It's also interesting that as this was being published throughout the world, Nebuchadnezzar is actually publishing the failure of his advisors. More tension at the staff meetings. The text continues. Some texts have the title, Daniel interprets the dream. Verse 19, then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. You see, Daniel understood what it meant, but he didn't know how to break the news. And so the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. But look at the wisdom with which Daniel approaches the king. Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. What Daniel was saying here is that he wished that the meaning of this dream was for your enemies. So that can't be good. Verse 20. The tree you saw, Daniel continued, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. So that's the first part of the dream. The tree represented the king. He's the great tree. He's the king of the world. But then Daniel continues. Verse 23, Your Majesty saw a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven and saying, Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. So, apparently Nebuchadnezzar was going to be cut down for a 7-year period. Not dead, but outside, living amongst the wild beasts and drenched with the morning dew. That can't be good. Verse 24, This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against the Lord the King. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. So once again, we see how brave Daniel was in giving the king bad news. Because you've got to remember, this is the guy who loved ruining people's houses, roasting his officers over a spit, burying people on the ground, chucking scorpions on them, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why Daniel hesitated. The irony of it is, I think that Nebuchadnezzar actually respected this, right? Verse 26. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar is going to be set aside for 7 years until his heavenly perspective is made right. God is in charge, Nebuchadnezzar isn't. But once this lesson has been learnt, Nebuchadnezzar will be restored. The great tree will grow again. But Daniel isn't finished. He has yet more courageous words. And again, remember, he's speaking to the king of the world. Therefore, in verse 27, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. And here we go. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be then that your prosperity will continue. So he's standing before the king. Repent, right? Now at this point, Daniel has finished his interpretation. And then we learn in the text that a year passes. We know that Nebuchadnezzar didn't throw his toys or anything like that. But it seems that over the next 12 months, Nebuchadnezzar then forgets what he's dreamt. And he's forgotten Daniel's interpretation of it. And the text continues in verse 28. The dream is fulfilled. All of this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of who? My majesty. Did you notice the I and the my? In other words, it's all about me, baby. And that's not going to end well. Nebuchadnezzar, once again, is on an ego trip. Now, friends, I just raise that because it's a danger that we all face, especially in places of leadership and authority. We always need to be on guard from taking ourselves too seriously. Why? because this is where pride can become a problem. And what was the saying that we open with? Pride comes before a fall. Pride is doing things in our own strength, and it actually reflects the original sin back in Genesis 3. And this is why God hates pride. So at this point, you can imagine Nebuchadnezzar standing on his palace roof. He's overlooking the great city of Babylon, boasting to himself and saying, "Look at what I have created." And you've got to remember, friends, that at that time, Babylon was the number one city in the world. And I thought I'd just share a few things from the ancient historian Herodotus, what he talked about Babylon. He described it as being 15 miles square, surrounded by 2 walls. The internal wall was 357 feet high. It was 87 feet wide. And they had a famous chariot race around the interior wall. Falling off a 350-foot wall tied to a chariot, that's not going to end well, right? But the external wall had about 250 watchtowers in place. And the river Euphrates flowed straight through the middle, right past the palace, which actually sets the scene for the next chapter. The famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon were still there and active at this point. Now, I just put up this quote on the screen from Herodotus, and he says this. He says, when he visited Babylon, he said that in the temple of Babylon, there is a second shrine lower down in which a great sitting figure of Bel, which was one of their key gods, of gold on a golden throne supported on a base of gold with a golden table standing beside it. I was told by the Chaldeans that to make this, more than 22 tons of gold were used. 22 tons of gold. So this reflected the fact that Babylon was the economic centre of the world. And that is something to be proud of. But that's the problem. Now, separate to this, I thought I'd put up something else I found in the British Museum, as you do. But there's an inscription by Nebuchadnezzar that says this: I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, I am the son of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, I who erected the Izida temple, I who built Procession Street, or the Procession Way, I who built the street of the forgiven son, the street of Nebu, and paged it with shimmering stones. Nebu, you the divine minister, grant me immortality. Did you notice the I, me, it's all about me, I, right? And that inscription was found in multiple places around Babylon and out in his kingdom. So this guy really thought that he was something. And as I said before, I think there's a lesson in this for all of us. As Christ followers, our most dangerous time will come on the heels of any victory that we have. And I think, friends, that's when people make their biggest mistakes. Not at the bottom, but often at the peak. The higher we go, the lower we go, is the way I say it in my mind. The higher we go, the more time we need to spend on our knees. What does Proverbs 26:12 say? It says this: there is more hope for fools than for people who think they are wise. Remember, friends, genuine humility puts God in control. And because of that, I just want to quickly look at 2 scriptures. The first one has a massive application for all of us here in this room this morning. Philippians 2, verses 2 to 8, is a great reminder for all of us about the importance of humility. It says this is Paul writing: then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Did you notice that in his ministry he never wandered around going, hey, I'm God. He didn't do that. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So friends, humility should be a value that we live out with each other. If we contrast that against Isaiah, the fall of Lucifer, right? It says this, what was going on in Satan's heart at the moment of this fall is, he says, "You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned in the mount of assembly." Right? "I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." So do you see the similarity between the fall of Satan and what Nebuchadnezzar was going through? Lucifer fell because of his pride, and Nebuchadnezzar also fell because of his pride. So, friends, pride is our greatest enemy. Humility is our greatest friend. God hates pride because the one with it is putting themselves in God's place. And God will have no rivals. And God also knows that any pride we have left unchecked will ultimately destroy us. He is God and we are not. Okay, back to Daniel 4. Sorry, we're getting there. So Nebuchadnezzar is on the roof of his palace, boasting to himself. Then look what happens. He gets himself in trouble. Verse 31. Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. Right? Now remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar writing this about himself. It's not a rumor. This is him. Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you." That's not good. "You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth, and he gives them to anyone he wishes." This is the lesson that his dream talked about 12 months earlier that he had forgotten. Another lesson, friends. If you feel that God has spoken to you, don't forget, right? But anyway, he's going to learn it the hard way. Verse 33, immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle, and his nails like the claws of a bird. And oh my goodness, there's so much written on that. There's all of these theories about these diseases that he got, right? My feeling is that we could talk about that all day long, but for whatever it was, God ordained something for Nebuchadnezzar specific to him, right? But clearly he wasn't in his right mind. At the end of that time, in other words, after 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honoured and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. It's like, wow, man, that's a massive statement when you think about who was saying this. Verse 35, all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? Verse 36, at the same time that my sanity was restored, my honour and splendour were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. It's interesting that if you read another document called the Babylonian Talmud, they go into this a little bit deeper. And the people in that document are discussing that when the king went through his 7-year period and he was actually cast out of his kingdom, there was a lone Jew that used to go and keep an eye on him. Who was that Jew? It was Daniel. And I think that's amazing. That's not in the Bible, that's in the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. Daniel's looking after Nebuchadnezzar. And I think both of them had like this mutual respect actually for each other. And I think him looking after Nebuchadnezzar on one hand was an extension of that respect. But I think Daniel also knew, hey, this guy's coming back, right? Then our last verse, verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. The end. That was the last, those were the last words ever recorded by the great King Nebuchadnezzar. Now we know in history that that was pinned around the kingdom in about 561 BC. And he died about 1 year later in October of the following year. And when he died, the Babylonian kingdom was at its height, right? And yet look at his last words. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So friends, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. I'm going to ask the team to come forward. I've really gone on this morning, eh? Sorry about that. But I just want to put it out there that as Christ believers, we have to remember that our entire society is fueled on pride, right? Everything is based on pride, and it's something that we need to keep ourselves in check over. I think for some of us, pride will be the greatest temptation that we will ever face. And pride sneaks in, right? It can be very, very subtle. I know that I've been guilty in the past of just subtly exalting myself over others. I know no one else in this room would have done that, but, you know. And that's something that I have to keep myself in check about. So pride is our greatest tripping point, but friends, humility is our greatest friend.